Ateapi chihintuki, nawoni awakanki he, wakantanka wajinaki, he wawita yuha nuwe. Amen. Please be seated. I am Bradley Hoff. I was born and raised in South Dakota. If you don't know where South Dakota is, it's south of North Dakota. My last name is spelled H-A-U-F-F, as you can see in the bulletin. H as in hotel, A as in alpha, U as in uniform, and 2 F's as in my high school report card. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Not about South Dakota. That really is south of North Dakota. I am the presiding bishop's missioner for Indigenous Ministries. I am enrolled in the Oglala Lakota Oyate, the Oglala Sioux tribe, as were my parents, who were both survivors of Indigenous residential schools. I prayed a prayer in Lakota at the beginning of this sermon, and I greet you with the Lakota words, How mitakuyepi. How mitakuyepi. I'd like for you to say that with me. First part is how. Wasn't that easy? That was so easy. Next one, a little more difficult. Mitakuyepi. Good. And now all together. How mitakuyepi. Wonderful. Now that you've said that out loud in church, do you want to know what it means? Maybe I shouldn't tell you. Don't worry, you didn't curse. It means hello, relatives. Hello, relatives. The Lakota people greet one another with these words, and not just people, not just fellow human beings. To the Lakota, as with virtually all indigenous people, everyone and everything exists in a state of relationship. A state of relationship. People, animals, fish, birds, every living thing, even insects. Insects, even mosquitoes. You ever imagine a mosquito as your relative? Just think of them as your country cousins whom you don't like to go visit. I was in Alaska recently, and I don't know if you've been to Alaska and seen the mosquitoes there. The mosquitoes in Alaska are huge. They're so big they're considered poultry. They won't go near Colonel Sanders. And they live a long time. I've heard that they hibernate, and it's like, you know, they could live into the next year. It's not unusual when you're in Alaska and a mosquito comes into a room and somebody says, "Oh, that's Ralph." I remember him from last year. What up, Ralph? We got to go to the vet next week. It's really, they're just huge. And they are our relatives. And even that which to the mind of Western civilization is not living, they are our relatives too. Wind, rocks, and the stars and planets of the cosmos. When Lakota people pray or whenever we speak, we typically conclude with the phrase, mitakwasi. Mitakwasi, which means all my relatives. To indigenous people, the universe is a living being, alive and well. The earth and the cosmos in its entirety are our relatives. They are not our possessions to exploit any more than one of your relatives would be. Think of it. All that is your relative. If you haven't yet seen things that way, think of how it would change your life and change your world if you did. There seem to be a lot of people in this world who believe that humans have dominance or should have dominance in and over the world. And there seems to be a religious dimension to this belief found in the Judeo-Christian tradition that God gave humans dominion over all of creation, as we read in the book of Genesis. But look what happens when humans do that sort of thing. We're seeing a lot of signs of that these days. A lot of the effects. Pollution, carbon footprint, global warming, and the effects of climate change. So often we are not responsible stewards of creation. Rather, we exert control over it and exploitation over it. I was reading an article online the other day about how debris from our space rovers and other vehicles on the surface of the planet Mars can be seen by cameras. They've taken pictures of it. Our garbage is already on Mars. We haven't even set foot on Mars. We may never set foot on the planet Mars, but already our garbage is there. It has preceded us. That's what happens when humans want to take control. Indigenous people don't look at it that way. We see ourselves as having a place in creation along with everything else that is, but we are not in control of it, and we wouldn't want to try to be, because it's not for us to do. We respect the place that the Great Spirit has given to us, and we obey the Spirit by not trying to go beyond that place. It is this kind of worldview, this indigenous worldview that I'm describing to you, that was taken advantage of by the Europeans who came to this hemisphere to take control and assert dominance. In search of land and riches and people to reduce to perpetual servitude. And it resulted in the worst, longest-lasting genocide in the history of humankind, the genocide enacted against indigenous tribal people. And it happened right here in our own backyard. Yet, we, the indigenous people, have been seen by so many as the bad guys over the years. The bad guys, the losers, relics of history, obsolete, invisible, forgotten. We're not supposed to be here anymore. We have two passages of Scripture this morning from 2 Kings and Luke that feature people who are also disliked, seen as the enemy, seen as inferior or having something wrong with them by their very identity. Naaman, the Aramean, suffering from the skin disease known as leprosy, and a Samaritan man, also with leprosy. Naaman was a commander of the army of Aram, which was in the vicinity of what is now Syria. He is sometimes referred to as Syrian, including by Jesus in the Gospels in one passage. He, by his very nature and identity, would have been seen by the people of Israel at the time as the enemy, someone who was not pious or worthy of salvation. And the Samaritans, while having a common ancestry with the Israelites, differed from the Israelites with regard to religious beliefs and practices and culture. Samaritans tended to be avoided by the Israelites. They too were seen as not pious or worthy of salvation. And on top of it all, these two persons have leprosy. So at the time they would have been ostracized, feared, seen as cursed. But in each of these stories, something amazing happens. Naaman and the Samaritan are cleansed of their disease. And they are cleansed because they do the right thing. They follow the guidance of two holy people of God. For Naaman, it's the prophet Elisha, and the Samaritan, it is Jesus. We see that Naaman is reluctant at first, but he goes to wash as he is instructed, and his skin is restored. In a similar way, the Samaritan goes to see the priests along with 9 other lepers as Jesus instructed them, and they are all cleansed on the way. But it is the Samaritan, the despised Samaritan, identified as the only one to return to give thanks to Jesus, which is the other right thing to do. In both of these instances, rather than exert their own will, rather than try to take control of the situation, they obey. They decide to obey and follow. So, contrary to popular belief, both Naaman and the Samaritan are not really the enemy. They are not cursed. They are, in fact, pious. They are absolutely worthy of salvation. They become teachers of faith, teaching us that our God is a God who finds the lost and restores them. Indigenous people have much to teach the people of the world through seeing all of creation as our relatives and not our possessions to control. The very values that our country tried to stomp out of existence, the values of the indigenous worldview, I believe, are the very things that can save the planet and save humanity today. But will the rest of us listen? Will the rest of us learn? I want to tell you that it is a pleasure and privilege to be here in Cincinnati for the celebration of Indigenous Peoples Day. I want you all to know that I really appreciate this. I appreciate you for doing this because it's so important. It reminds people that we, the Indigenous, are still here. It acknowledges what has happened to us since 1492. It gives us the opportunity to tell our stories, and it challenges the long-held Columbus discovery and manifest destiny narratives of America. As Christians and Americans, we need to come to terms with our history, the history of all of us, and how it compares to mythological narratives that we see and hear so often. To do this, we need to consider and take seriously the interpretations of past events from alternative perspectives. Abandoning the Columbus discovery narrative is central to this. Replacing Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day allows for the acknowledgement of Indigenous people in this country and what happened with us. It allows for truth-telling. It promotes an honest examination of our past. It dispels the myth and the atrocity of white dominance. It teaches that Indigenous people are a significant part of the American story, past and present. The church should be a central part of making this transition happen. By doing so, the church will help correct the mistakes of the past and liberate the gospel from narratives that are based in dominance, control, greed, and hate. It remains a tragedy that the gospel of Jesus Christ was brought to this hemisphere along with the narrative of white supremacy. And to this day, the gospel has not yet completely and effectively been separated from that narrative. That is our work to do. And it's not going to be easy work. It requires intentional effort. It demands courage. There are many in the United States today who love the traditional mythological narrative of America, and they don't want it criticized or changed. Doing that to them, they say, comes across as being radical extremist and even un-American. They don't want it messed with. They don't understand the pain of those who've been left out of it. So we can expect visceral opposition to this sort of thing. But it is unacceptable to not acknowledge the actual events of history, to minimize them, or simply to say that we did something in the past that was wrong, but that was in the past. We need to do what we can today to make up for it, to the extent that it is possible to do. Rejecting the Columbus discovery narrative and the day it celebrates will go a long way in this process. So I want to thank you for doing this, for celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day. It challenges us to stop living a lie. You are a people of great awareness and courage and compassion, and I'm grateful for your love for Indigenous people. This is my third trip to Cincinnati and Christ Church Cathedral. I'm happy to say that each trip has been a wonderful experience. I'm not sure I can get used to eating spaghetti with chili. Or maybe it's chili with spaghetti. There's a right way to say it, and I'm not sure I'm doing it correctly. But aside from that, I feel like I fit in here with you all because you are so kind and so hospitable. As an Indigenous person, I feel like I have a place here, a place in the world, and a place in Cincinnati and Christ Church Cathedral. So in Lakota, I say to you, Pelamia, thank you. You are a blessing from God. Keep up the good work. Mitakwasi.